and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you enjoy this conversation on Trendlines, you can get more of WPR's news and analysis directly in your inbox by registering for our free daily newsletter. You'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. For many Belarusians, Alexander Lukashenko is the only president they've ever known. The former collective farm manager won Belarus's first election in 1994, 3 years after the country's separation from the Soviet Union, and has stayed in power ever since by strictly controlling the flow of information and stifling any signs of dissent. Now, however, Lukashenko faces the greatest challenge yet to his leadership. He claimed victory in yet another election earlier this month that was widely decried as fraudulent, but it was preceded by a wave of pro-democracy protests across the country that have only grown in the wake of official results that showed Lukashenko winning with around 80% of the vote. The government's brutal suppression tactics against the protests, including a bloody crackdown by security forces last week that left at least 2 people dead and hundreds more injured, have only poured fuel on the fire. Calls of solidarity with the protesters have now spread to workers at state-owned factories, journalists at state media outlets, and even some members of the police force. Throughout it all, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been quietly watching and even offering to send assistance to Lukashenko. Joining me now to discuss the truly historic situation in Belarus is Candice Rondeau. She's a professor of practice at the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University and a senior fellow with the Center on the Future of War, a joint initiative of Arizona State and the think tank New America. She's also a weekly columnist with WPR, and you can read her column every Friday. Candice, welcome to Trendlines.
Hey, Elliot. Great to be here.
I know you've been monitoring the footage and some of the on-the-ground reports that have been coming out of Belarus, some of which are just really astonishing and reveal a lot about what the people of Belarus have put up with for the past 26 years under Lukashenko. As a longtime observer of the region, I wonder what jumps out at you most about the events of the past couple weeks there.
Well, I think the thing that's really striking about the situation in Belarus right now is we have kind of a breaking point where it isn't a bunch of opposition leaders who are super well known. In fact, you have an opposition leader who has sort of stepped in and acted as a surrogate for her husband. And you have this sort of groundswell of popular support, not for her per se, which is, unusual in some of these other color revolutions. You've had big names, big personalities, people who have been around and about. Big change here is really around the popular support and how broad it is. We see academics, we see housewives, we see even police right now beginning to turn the tide against Lukashenko. So that's one very notable feature, is just that this is sort of, it's not exactly leaderless, but it is a groundswell that is broad. It reaches across not just, cosmopolitan Belarus. It's not just in Minsk, the capital. It's every city, every town, it seems to be caught up in this moment and in this movement. And the other piece here is instead of a situation where you have broad support, or I should say strong support from the Kremlin that is very clear, very pronounced, we have maybe a little bit of opacity, maybe a little bit of muddiness. Nobody seems to know exactly where the Kremlin stands right now vis-a-vis its old-time ally in Minsk. And Alexander Lukashenko keeps reaching out, trying to give the impression that he has Putin's support, that Putin has his back. But the signs and signals that you would normally see, or you might expect to see, haven't been as clear or as strong. So those are 2 key features: is the sort of groundswell of popular support, how broad it is, and then the fact that you have this external benefactor or ally of the Lukashenko regime who has, given him a lot of power vis-a-vis all kinds of things, not the least of which is, of course, trade and arms and so forth. And we don't see that kind of clarity of allyship from the Kremlin. The other striking point here is that we have the involvement of a NATO power, Lithuania in this instance, because, of course, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the opposition candidate who many believe actually did win the election, has fled to Lithuania and received support from the Minister of Foreign Affairs there, and obviously from the Lithuanian government more generally. And so what's unusual about this situation, very different from some other color revolutions, is that you've got different geography, different internal dynamics, and different external dynamics.
You mentioned the opposition candidate, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who's now in Lithuania. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about her and the kind of opposition figure that she is. As you mentioned, very unusual. She was almost dragooned into doing this. She never really wanted a life in politics until her husband was arrested. And there are also a few other unlikely opposition figures like her. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about them and the kind of movement that they represent.
So Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, of course, is married to a very popular blogger, YouTube star, who has been calling out the Lukashenko government for years, and ultimately was jailed just before the elections, was not allowed to even participate. And at the end of the day, what this ended up doing, the act that was meant to suppress the opposition, ultimately ended up giving more fuel to this idea that Sergei Tikhanovskaya's wife, Svetlana, could step in for her. There were two other opposition candidates, two women, and they joined forces. And they, ultimately they kind of gave her the mantle. And she, through that, was able to really unite, I think, the opposition. I think there's some other opposition figures that are worth mentioning. Valery Tsepkalo, who was, of course, the former Belarus ambassador to the United States, and now sort of residing in exile. Certainly a very serious player, and somebody who probably in any other color revolution situation might have been kind of the preferred candidate for many different reasons. But it ended up being Tikhanovskaya in large part because she represented, I think, in a way, some of the ambivalence that the Belarus street really feels. There is, of course, frustration with 26 years of dictatorship, with economic stagnation, with political stagnation, with being an outlier state that doesn't really have many allies other than Russia and China. But there is also, I think, there has always been a sense of reservation around the kind of sort of populist, almost Ukraine, Georgia, kind of anti-Kremlin push that you might have seen in other places. And that kind of reflects, I think, some part, the culture itself, which is an extremely Russian culture. So Tikhanovskaya is the kind of opposition leader who is, as you say, a reluctant leader. And as we saw, that reluctance, unfortunately, I think kind of undercut her at a crucial moment when strength was needed. She ultimately was forced to flee the country after going to challenge the election results, which she bravely did. And clearly there was some sort of duress being imposed on her by Lukashenko and his regime, whether it was against her husband or against the family in general. The long arm of authoritarian rule, we know, in that part of the world doesn't know any political boundaries, doesn't understand geographical boundaries, and certainly that had to be a big motivation for her. So as a candidate, she also I think represented, sort of a generation who had come of age during Lukashenko's long rule. She's really not that much older than his political lifetime, right? And so in some ways, she is the kind of political memory of a country that has really struggled to throw off the yoke, while the rest of Eastern Europe has moved ahead. And I think in some parts, one of the reasons that this this anthem of Kino, which is a great sort of Russian band that was during the Soviet time, post-Soviet era, very popular kind of protest band. One of the reasons you're seeing like Kino being revived is because that's the voice of that generation. They have a very distinct memory. I certainly have a very distinct memory of Kino. I went to school probably around the same time, went to college around the same time as Tikhanovskaya. I'm only maybe 10 years older. So anybody who knows that part of the world understands that opposition has kind of a generational quality to it. And it also has a very pronounced ethnic quality to it. And I think, while we're seeing some of these comparisons, as I alluded to before, to places like Armenia or Kyrgyzstan, where there were color revolutions, but not on the scale of Georgia or Ukraine, some of that sort of deep tie to Russian culture is being evinced in this opposition.
Since you brought up the comparisons with the other color revolutions and some of the situations in nearby countries, I wonder what your thoughts are on this comment that Thomas DeWall, the journalist and now expert at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, made on Twitter the other day. He said that a lot of the comparisons to what's going on in Belarus are being made to Ukraine in 2014, but really the stronger comparison is to Armenia in 2018, because there aren't quite as many cries for a closer association with the West and with Europe that we saw in Ukraine. It's much more of a nationalist project for the good of the country.
Listen, I mean, Thomas DeWall is one of the smartest people I know when it comes to understanding this post-Soviet space. He's been there since the year dot, and he watched it all unfold, as a reporter. I think he may be right in some senses. This is definitely different than Ukraine. This is definitely different than Georgia. It has some of the contours, as we mentioned, that seem to be common to Kyrgyzstan and Armenia in the sense that there's a more sort of national bent to a lot of the sort of protest movement. At the same time, just because there isn't a demand for ascension in the EU today doesn't mean there isn't a desire for greater economic integration with the West more generally. You don't need to have a Maidan-style kind of protest movement built around these kind of machinations that we saw in Ukraine in order for there to be a desire to have greater economic possibility than you have today, to have a fear of the long arm of the Kremlin reaching inside of the country. That's very real. And frankly, Lukashenko played on that. What's different about this situation in, say, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, and frankly, Ukraine, is that Lukashenko has played every single side he can play in terms of his rhetoric. On the one hand, you have apparently, dozens of mercenaries in the country ready to strike. On the other, he will beat apparently those who protest against him, as we saw in some of the reaction to the factory workers in Minsk who were protesting the other day. So I think that there are some substantial differences here that maybe just don't have a base for comparison. I mean, every revolution is different. And I do think that the geography and the culture is going to be very significant here. And frankly, the other big difference is in Kyrgyzstan and Armenia, you kind of have a long established opposition movement that already had its legs well preceding the kind of revolutions that we saw there, going back all the way to the Soviet times, in large part because of that ethnic split. And Belarus doesn't have that tradition. It's new. Just because it's new doesn't mean it's totally nationalist, or there isn't some sort of nascent desire for a shift. What it does mean, though, I think, and Thomas DeWall, I think, is probably right about this, is that you cannot predict who will emerge very quickly and what will be the kind of the catalyzing issue that will bring things to a head with Lukashenko actually leaving office. There's a great expectation that he will, though. And I think, time will tell. What would be the triggering moment? We really can't say, because we do not know enough, unfortunately, because that's how deep the suppression of political voices of any kind in Belarus has been in the last 20 years, and certainly in the last 5 or 6 years. We don't really know enough. The media environment has not been very well developed, and it's not a place, frankly, that neither Europe or the United States or any other outside benefactor outside of Russia has really invested in terms of growing civil society and reach within civil society.
I should mention to our listeners that we're recording this on Monday, so a whole lot could change between now and when this episode goes live. But in the meantime, you're right. It does seem like there's this mysterious quality to what actually does force an autocrat to leave office. I mean, watching some of the appearances that Lukashenko has made, speeches at factories, for instance, he has seemed visibly shaken in some situations. And I think he has promised some concessions, right? Even just this week, he announced that he would be willing to have a constitutional referendum and even hold new elections after that if it was what protesters wanted. Do you think that might help the situation, that it might mollify some of the demonstrations?
I really don't see that he now has the credibility where his speech acts then translate into political acts for anybody, except for his very closest inner circle. We even saw, just as early as today, he went out to the Minsk wheel tractor factory, which of course is a big sort of defense installation where, different types of vehicles are made. And while people were shouting him down, he was telling them, no, there will be no more elections. So I think the situation is as fluid for the street in Belarus as it is for Lukashenko. He is desperate, and everybody can see that. He hasn't had that lightning bolt moment, although I think, some may interpret his reaction to the factory workers who called him out and told him to leave, may interpret that as his aha moment. I think the reality is a little bit more stark than that. Unfortunately, he has deluded himself for a very long time into believing, he has legitimacy, he has a right, and there are those around him who could lose a lot. We haven't really seen some of the sort of wealthy elites stepping forward to defend him in a very vocal way, although we know that they're there. We know that they have things at risk. While people have kind of compared this moment to his Ceausescu moment, where he kind of has this aha look on his face when he's facing these striking factory workers, I'm not so convinced. And first of all, yes, things could get very violent. I think, we've already seen that the police, and the military are ready to visit extreme violence on the people of Belarus. And some Belarusians are not willing to take it. There's been, some fighting back, but there's been more unarresting, I think, in peaceful protests. I don't think we're in a Romania situation. But I can see a situation where it would be possible that even yet another exercise, like some sort of constitutional referendum, would be greeted, I think, ultimately with even more people on the street. Why repeat the exercise of a rigged election and replace it with a rigged referendum? I can't imagine the logic behind anybody in the opposition following that and saying, yes, we're ready to embrace that as a path forward. There needs to be a different kind of impetus here. And it's not totally clear what that's going to be. Again, this comes back to kind of the essence of the movement, meaning, Belarusian civil society is about kind of where maybe Georgia was more like in the 1980s in terms of its development, in terms of its muscularness. But this leaves open the question, can movements sustain themselves without these institutional pillars, NGOs that are really there to support everything from rule of law causes to just getting people unarrested, getting them out of detention. We did see, I think Lukashenko make an attempt to cool things down with the release of several political prisoners. But I don't think that's going to be enough because, unfortunately, the temptation here of every autocrat, is the same as it is for Lukashenko, which is arrest your way out of the problem, beat your way out of the problem, try and see if you can bide more time until some sort of savior comes. I don't see the savior coming.
Is the closest thing to a savior that he has Vladimir Putin?
Vladimir Putin has always been the best shot for Lukashenko until he hasn't. And we have seen, with the conversation around integration of the Eurasian Union, Lukashenko has kind of used the Kremlin and Putin almost as a kind of political character foil. Whenever he finds himself against the wall, he hasn't embraced fully this idea of integration into the Eurasian Union and has been sort of slow-footing it the whole time. So what are the reasons for that? What could they possibly be? Some people point to some motivation, some desire to join the West. It may actually be more that he's looking for a signal from China. Let's not forget that the Belt and Road initiative is a big one for Belarus. There's an enormous amount of infrastructure investment there, and it is ultimately going to be, at some point or another, it will be developed as some sort of, very substantial trading bridge for China. And China has not yet given the signal that one way or the other, beyond sort of acknowledging Lukashenko as, the legitimate leader of Belarus, there's been no signs from Xi Jinping that he also intends to step in, right? And certainly that's not China's style. It's a bridge too far for China. So in a way, the game of chicken is really more of a three-way game of chicken between Russia, China, and Belarus than it is with the EU and NATO, which I think is very clear about its own bright lines.
So from Putin's perspective, he's looking at this unrest in Belarus, a very strategically important country for Russia. What are his options now, and what are the risks that he's weighing as he thinks about what next step to take?
The thing with Putin is, just like Bashar al-Assad in Syria, you always have to be aware that Putin is prepared to jettison relationships that are not convenient. And in a way, his very personalized politics allows him to do that. The sort of informal handshake, buddy-buddy relationship that he's had with Lukashenko, pick up the phone and I'll be there. That kind of relationship does a lot of things for Putin. It is how he has operated throughout his career, and it has been extremely successful for him because when that personal relationship seems to go south, he can always say, I still support the state apparatus as it stands, right? I still support the authoritarian or autocratic status quo, even if my good friend Alexander Lukashenko is no longer somebody that we want to invite to tea. We're still standing behind the status quo. And so that actually, I think, will probably serve Putin very well. It always has. There's no reason why he can't sort of lean back and let the chips fall where they may. What Putin probably cannot afford to do, and I think this is where everybody is quite aware, is involve himself in another intervention, another imbroglio. He needs to signal that he is willing to do so. He needs to do that in a number of different ways. And we're already seeing, for instance, on Russia Today, the propaganda channel of Moscow, there's sort of these intimations from the editorial line that, yes, Russia is prepared to step in and should be prepared. Calls for polite people, the little green men, to come storming into Belarus. So, the signaling is there, but it's light. And some of the things that we saw, for instance, in Ukraine, which is sort of this prepping of the population beforehand through various media channels, it wasn't nearly as aggressive this time, at least as far as I can tell. In Ukraine, in Georgia, there was almost a year's walk right up to the moment when the spark of revolution started, where you had an enormous investment by the political apparatus in propaganda, in sort of softening the population, getting them on side with the idea that Russia was prepared to be a good ally for the status quo. I think we're seeing some signs that actually there is a limit to what Putin can do. And frankly, no matter what we think of this vaccine that has now been introduced by Moscow, it's not a silver bullet. And I think it's designed to be a silver bullet for other purposes, primarily to promote the idea that everything is again copacetic at home in Russia at a time when there are protests in Khabarovsk, when we have the possibility of growing unrest because of COVID and how it has been handled, but also the economic impact on the country amid massive infrastructure challenges because of climate change. So honestly, Putin has a limited set of options here, but he has to signal that he is willing to step forward if needed. Otherwise, it will look like he's weak.
Would he be willing to countenance a situation where Lukashenko stepped down, Tikhanovskaya returned, new elections were called, and a much more Western-friendly government came into power in Minsk?
Well, what is a Western-friendly government these days? One would have thought that Poland, Hungary, Austria, these were once Western-friendly governments, weren't they? I think Putin may have seen another path to influencing populations other than the kind of standard, puppet dictator or puppet dictator friend. And actually, the political warfare that he's waged in Eastern Europe, particularly in Hungary, and especially now in Poland, it has been very successful, actually. So he knows he has a population that is ripe for manipulation. I don't think, though, you would see necessarily a rush to support Tikhanovskaya. Perhaps if she is perceived to be weak, but that doesn't do her any favors, right? At the end of the day, if this is in fact, as we say, does have sort of a nationalist cast, it's less Euromaidan and sort of more French Revolution almost, then actually Putin must understand that it does him no favors to openly back Tikhanovskaya, right? And in fact, to openly back an opposition figure for the Kremlin really is probably anathema. So not a lot of plays there, actually, unless there's somebody waiting in the wings that we're not aware of, right? There's always that possibility. Last play, probably the best play, the strongest play for the Kremlin and for Lukashenko would be a military coup.
What do you mean by that when you say that would be the best play for Lukashenko?
A military coup would allow Lukashenko to walk away, saying it was out of his hands. He was no longer in control, but that it was by his own people, his own apparatus. He could depart to Russia, I assume, Yanukovych style, right, the former leader of Ukraine, have a nice, happy life, get a nice dacha somewhere in the outskirts of Moscow, and live quietly out his days. At the same time, it allows Russia to do what it needs to do, which is to maintain influence and ultimately maintains the sort of autocratic status quo. And the person, whoever that may be, could be the Minister of Defense, it could be somebody, maybe lower down within the military ranks. That person could really be somebody that would be very well known, right? I mean, one thing we have to understand is that Belarus and Russia do have military cooperation agreements. They're known to each other. It's the same system practically. It's almost seamless. And there's a KGB in Belarus. There's no longer a KGB in Russia, but there might as well be. And so I think that, from a chess playing perspective, if you could put it that way, if I were sitting in Lukashenko's seat, that might be the best I could hope for, is a military coup that would allow me to leave without violence being done to me and those who are close to me, and to sort of say my hands were tied. It was out of my willpower to influence events.
Interesting. What is the calculus on the Western side for Brussels, for NATO countries? What are some of the options that they have in store for them? Because there have been efforts by the U.S. and other Western countries to draw Belarus more into the Western orbit in the lead up to these protests.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think The thing I think that is very different about this time in the history of NATO is, here we have this military alliance that is now 70 years old and is on very shaky ground. It's very shaky legs. And so when you look at NATO now, and so when you think about Europe and what's its response, you almost have to break it up into three parts, right? There are the Baltic states that increasingly feel threatened by Russia. They are, bulking up their military. They are bulking up their intelligence resources. They're looking primarily to the United States for assistance with that because they know the United States has the deepest pockets and also, frankly, the greatest desire to sell its military goods and hardware, to that part of Europe. Then there's, of course, sort of Europe Central, that is, Germany and France, which is this other part of NATO. And there is an increasing agreement, I think, between the two most important contributors on continental Europe to NATO, of course, that there needs to be a more robust investment in collective defense on the European continent. But as you know, things in Europe, they're often very slow to sort of process, to move. And even though, you hear in conferences on defense and security all across Europe over the last couple of years, this sort of cry for greater self-sufficiency, less dependency on the United States, you haven't seen those kind of moves in a really dramatic way. And so that kind of middle tier of NATO is really kind of hamstrung in terms of what it can and can't do. But it wants to signal to certainly Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia that it is prepared to be there for the Baltic states in the event that Belarus should shift in some way. The last third part here, of course, is the United States, and the United States is nowhere. Reality is the United States no longer has a real position on NATO anymore, other than it's on autopilot. And, you can point at the Trump administration and say it's their fault, but the reality is this is just as much on Congress as it is on, our national security apparatus. These complaints about burden sharing, they're real, and some of them are quite well founded, but they have, again, sort of like, Germany and France, these internal debates about our investment in NATO have also hamstrung us at a time when Russia is really very well positioned to exploit a situation like we have in Belarus.
Candace, it's great hearing your thoughts on this. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Elliot.
Candace Rondeau is a professor of practice in the School of Politics and Global Studies at Arizona State University and a senior fellow with the Center on the Future of War, a joint initiative of Arizona State and the think tank New America. You can read her weekly column at worldpoliticsreview.com every Friday. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and WPR on Twitter. And while you're at it, don't forget to sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.